You'll never know what waits on the far side of the water until it comes up and stands at your door. Welcome back. Tonight is the largest collection we've ever put together. 20 disturbing, true Appalachian survival stories, all sent in by people who were alone in hollows, cabins, lakeshores, and on ridgeline trails when something went wrong. A quick, necessary warning before we begin. Some accounts contain threats, invasion, and moments that survivors describe as abusive or predatory. Where a story touches on child-related concerns or deeply upsetting behavior, I'll give a short content note beforehand and keep the language restrained. These are witness accounts. Where a crime is alleged, I will say so as reported. If that sits heavy, listen with care. Story 1. The Girl at Black Pine Lake. Black Pine Lake, late August. I was 24, camping by myself for the first time, thinking the lake would quiet my head. The night smelled like rotten pine and hot motor oil from the boats that still lingered at the launch. Moon was thin, reflected on the water like a pale coin. I remember the way the trees drew the sound into them, everything smaller, closer. I set my little camp stove, made coffee, and read until the pages blurred. That was normal. Then a small voice called from the dark across the water. "Hey!" it shouted, high and practiced, like a kid who'd learned to get attention. I thought maybe another camper. The voice came again, closer to shore, and when I looked toward the far edge, I saw a little silhouette standing under the dock lights, small and lit like a rag doll. At first, I thought it was a child with a flashlight. The way it moved made my skin crawl. No backpack, no wet footprints, nothing that made sense for someone who'd been out in the woods by themselves. I rowed a little out to sea, just enough so my light skimmed the surface. The figure didn't wave or run. Instead, it tapped the post of the dock, rhythmically, like a metronome. I called back, "Hey, you okay?" And the voice answered in a different tone, older or trying to be older. "Come closer. We want to show you something." I turned the boat back and nosed into my little cove. Later, when I told friends, some laughed it off as a kid playing around. But that night, the tapping started on my own dock. Not with wood, something soft, like fingers. Then there was a pattern of scratches on the side of my tent, right above where I slept. I unzipped and shone my headlamp into the trees. Branches, nothing. But on my external gear, someone had tied a little bundle, a torn piece of fabric, 2 small stones, and a Polaroid tucked under them. I only found the Polaroid when daylight came. It was a shot of my camp from the angle of the trees, my tent, my stove, my unopened can of coffee, taken in the middle of the night. I knew I had locked my things, and I had no idea how anyone had gotten that close without leaving prints. I called the ranger. They checked around the shore and found a single set of footprints, small shoe prints that disappeared at the waterline and never reappeared. There was no definitive answer. When I left that morning, I felt watched, like the trees had been looking through me. Afterwards, I couldn't camp alone for months. I kept dreaming about small hands in the dark, tapping. Sometimes I still wake up with the sound of fingernails on canvas. The witness insisted there'd been a person there. Police logged the report and found the photographs, but no arrest was made. Some locals said Black Pine had a reputation for pranksters. Others would say things about lost children and apparitions. The survivor never returned to that lake. The forest often keeps its own proof and its own silence. Story 2. Pictures in the Attic. An old lake house on a ridge above Clear Hollow, inherited from an aunt who'd passed away in winter. Autumn afternoon, the house smelled like dry wood and the kind of dust that sits for years in sunlight. I went up to sort through boxes. The attic was a narrow crawl space behind an old door in the upstairs hallway, the kind of place you only open when you need boxes of Christmas ornaments. I remember the sunlight catching the dust motes and how small the house felt without the aunt in it. That ordinary domestic quiet settled around me. My flashlight picked out a string of photos pinned to a joist, faces cut from magazines and scrolled on snapshots. At first, I thought somebody had been making decorations.
Then I saw the pictures of my own life taped up on the board. A photo from my high school graduation that I'd posted online years ago, a family snapshot from a holiday, a candid picture of me with friends at a lake last summer. None of those had been left behind by my aunt. Some of the pictures had scribbled notes on the backs, times, little observations, words like likes to run, sleeps here. My hands shook as I kept crawling and found a narrow space behind the insulation where someone had built a tiny living area. An old thrift store mattress, a makeshift stove, a wall of more photos, and, terrifyingly, an old phone cradle with a charging cord. The cord had blackened ends like it had been used for a long time. This was a living presence, someone who'd been inside my house. I called the police. They dusted for prints, found a few partials of long, garbled, seasonal dirt, nothing conclusive. Neighbors later told me they'd seen a person on the property at odd hours, someone in a coat that looked too heavy for the weather. The officer who took my report told me he had seen this before, squatters, voyeurs, who tuck themselves into crawl spaces and live off the grid. He called them oddball trespassers, which made it sound small and bureaucratic, but when I slept that night, I woke to the sound of someone moving in the ceiling. I moved out within a week. The house sold fast, and the new owners ripped the joists out of the attic.
When they did, they found pieces of string, a dented thermos, and another few Polaroids of the house living room taken through a keyhole. The witness said the feeling of invasion never left. When she hears a creak in a rental property now, she assumes someone else has been there. This kind of violation rearranges how you carry your life. Sleep stops being a right and becomes a privilege you have to earn. Story 3. Window watching on a honeymoon. A one-week getaway in late spring, a cabin tucked into a valley with glass that let you watch stars like a neighbor. We wanted privacy, no cell service, a place to disconnect. The first day was perfect. Hikes, cheap wine, the kind of lazy smiling that feels safe. By the second evening, I noticed a light across the valley, small and moving like someone walking with a flashlight. At first, I told myself it was deer hunters. My partner laughed and said we were being paranoid. Those were the normal things: mountain people, trail crews, someone checking old fences. That night, we left the curtain cracked because of the heat. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of small steps in the graveled yard outside. I got up to look through the crack. In the sliver of darkness, I saw the silhouette of someone standing near the woodpile, head cocked as if listening. When the figure moved, it looked like they were pacing, and then they stopped, turned their head slowly to where our cabin windows were. For a long second, I felt seen, like a bug pinned by a light. My partner slept through it. He's a deep sleeper. And when I nudged him, I felt ridiculous. The next morning, we found a scrap of cloth draped over the porch rail, a hairline of wet mud on the bottom step. We joked that Appalachian raccoons were getting bold. That afternoon, as we packed to leave early, we found two things taped under the front door: an old Polaroid blistered from heat, and a slim length of fishing line with a ring of keys affixed. The Polaroid showed our car parked where we had left it, taken from a place down the slope we couldn't see except from a tiny trail. When I checked the photo closely, I could see someone's shoulder reflected in the glass. Too close, too deliberate. We left without saying goodbye to the valley. On the drive out, my hands still shook. My partner and I argued on the way home. Later, we learned that the feeling of being watched had followed us into our marriage in small ways. Extra locks, avoiding late-night walks. The witness described it as stalking. She reported the items to the local sheriff. They logged it, but found no one. Whether it was a man with binoculars or someone wired for attention, the effect was the same. The cabin stopped being a refuge. Story 4. The Fog Woman by Granddad's Field. June. An old farmhouse near a farmer's field that runs down to a small hollow where my granddad used to go hunting. It was the sort of place that smelled like leather and cut hay. I went to help with a neighbor's fence line, and the day slid into evening as it always did. Golden light, crickets stepping up. There was a fog that night that came in like breath, low to the ground, sticking to the holler grass. I remember the fog because it made everything close and muffled, like sound wrapped in cotton. While we worked the fence, someone waved from across a stand of thin trees, a woman-shaped blur, pale against the dusk. I assumed she was a neighbor's wife or a friend of my granddad's. When I walked over, she didn't speak. She stood with her hands folded and watched. Up close, her boots were muddy and her hair hung like a curtain. She looked wrong in ways I couldn't name. Too still, too patient. That night, the neighbor's dog refused to enter the field. It whimpered and paced like it was expecting someone it had seen before. The next day, my granddad said he'd seen figures in the fog before. The old people on the ridge, the ones who drifted along county roads at dawn. Older folks told stories about the watching women, spirits or recluses who followed farms for reasons no one ever agreed on. I didn't want to get into that. When we checked the field, the woman was gone. But we found a string of old buttons sewn to a low branch, small white circles threaded like teeth. I didn't sleep well after that, keeping the porch light on for a week. The neighbors swore they hadn't known anyone by that description. Some folks called it a local ghost story. I called it an odd, prolonged unease. There was no police report, no reason to treat it as anything but one more strange night. These early stories share something in common, a presence that observes and then retreats, a little proof left behind, and the feeling of being singled out by something that knows you can be frightened. If any of these are hitting a chord, if you're new and want more real-life Appalachian horror, hit subscribe and leave which one unsettled you in the comments. There are more, and they get stranger. Story 5, Eyes in My Ceiling. Late autumn, a remote rental cabin with thin walls and a sagging porch. I was alone, tending to my father's affairs and staying the week to sort paperwork. On the first night, I woke before dawn to the sound of things shifting in the attic, a thud, then a soft slide. The old house made noises, that's normal, but there was a different rhythm this time, deliberate and close to my bedroom ceiling. I lay there counting the beats, feeling the house breathe with me. The sound stopped, then came back in a slow walk from one end of the house to the other. When I went upstairs with a flashlight, I found scratch marks on the attic floor and a little corner torn open where insulation hung like moss. Between the rafters, someone had set up a small vantage. 2 jars with candle wax hardened on their rims, and a tiny camera lens knocked out of an old disposable camera. The lens was aimed down through a gap in the ceiling into my bedroom. I told my sister, and she told me that in this county, there had been cases of people living in attics for years. Squatters with voyeur tendencies, she said, but her voice had a hard edge to it. Police came and treated it as trespassing and possible voyeurism. Their report noted the camera parts, but couldn't say who had put them there. My sister found muddy footprints on the shed roof and a footprint on the porch that matched none of ours. After that, I couldn't sleep without checking the room above. I kept thinking of eyes catching me as I changed my shirt, the way a camera waits without movement. For months, I avoided rentals with attics. I learned to ask, are there crawl spaces? Has anyone complained? It felt like a small, paranoid set of questions to have to ask. The witness asserted someone had been watching from above. The evidence supported that claim, though no one was ever caught. Story 6, The Man in the Attic. A winter storm trapped me overnight in a friend's cabin. We slept downstairs, candles bright, the wood stove making the walls sweat. In the morning, they joked about how the cabin felt like a fortress. That day, my friend decided to check the attic for extra blankets. He came out shaking. "There's a makeshift bed in there," he said. "Someone's living in the rafters." He told me about blankets folded like a nest, a dented thermos, and a worn pair of boots left by the joist. There were signs someone had been there for weeks,
food wrappers, a smudged journal page, and a string with pockets of rusty change. We both called the sheriff. They took one look and said they'd seen similar things in other hollows, people who survive off odd jobs and know how to hide in attics and crawl spaces. The sheriff said they'd patrol for a week. They found nothing else, but this left us uneasy in a place we'd thought safe. My friend said he heard someone walking in the attic that night, boots dragging. He swore the person was human and frightened, not someone strange and other. They were hungry, he said later, and tired. But that's not how it felt to me. That night I dreamed of hands reaching down from the darkness above, like the attic itself wanted to pull someone in. Sometimes the predator is just someone who's decided to live off your absence. Sometimes it's more complicated. We locked our things and checked the loft twice a day until the sheriff's patrol reports showed no more activity. Story 7, The Deerhead in My Photos. A summer wedding at a remote lodge 3 years ago. My job was photographer, which meant I wandered the grounds late into the night looking for candid light. After the reception, I wandered to the edge of the tree line with my camera. The woods were thick with moths and a steady chorus of frogs. When I returned to load cards into my laptop, I saw a sequence of images I didn't remember taking. A stationary figure in the tree line wearing what looked like a deer skull with antlers. In some shots, the figure stood perfectly still, like it knew exactly where my lens would fall. In others, it took a step forward, and the antlers seemed to press through the branches. I checked timestamps. There was a 30-minute gap where my lens had recorded footage, but I had no memory of shooting. My friends joked that I'd been drunk. I swore I hadn't. When I showed a friend the images, she paled and said she'd seen that shape before, down the road, at night. People who wear taxidermy masks as a kind of ritual scare, or local kids pulling pranks. The lodge owner took the photos seriously enough to put out a notice to regulars. A few people reported seeing a headlight in the trees that night. No one claimed the antlered figure. Later, I started getting messages on social media, anonymous, blurred, with single words like "watch." My work suffered. I began to delete images rather than archive them. I stopped going back to the lodge for events. The witness was convinced someone had been watching with a strange costume. Others suggested a hunter and a creative moment. The ambiguity never settled. There are places in these mountains where the line between a prank and a threat is very thin. Story 8. Footsteps in the Wall. A newlywed couple rented a small cabin for a brief escape in early spring. They thought the creaks were the house settling until the night the footsteps started inside the wall that separated the bedroom from the living room. She told me she heard them first, light steps like a person walking on a thin plank, pacing back and forth. The house was small enough that the sound rattled dishes. At first they chalked it up to mice or raccoons, but then an old coat hook on the inside wall fell off, and there was a handprint on the plaster, faint, as if someone had recently pushed from inside. They found a smear of soot along the beam, like someone had been trying to pry a small panel open. They called the owner, who came by with a flashlight and a polite shrug. He'd had rumors about the place. Kids in the 90s went playing there, but no hard claims. The couple slept at a motel that night. In the morning, the owner came back with a contractor. When they opened a seam in the wall, they found an old crawl space barely big enough for a man to curl up in, and inside, a tattered sleeping bag, a small radio with static, and 2 tiny Polaroids showing the couple asleep in their bed. The owner was pale. He swore he had been the only one with keys. The police treated it as trespassing and potential voyeurism. No one was found. The couple divorced a year later. She told me the violation had become a mirror for other broken trust in the marriage. Even now, she said, she flinches at the sound of drywall settling. The experience didn't only end a holiday, it remade how she slept and who she trusted. Between these cabin and attic stories, there is a pattern of people occupying the edges of safe spaces. Attic rafters,
crawl spaces, the underside of porches, and turning them into observation points. The effect is not always violent in the criminal sense, but the betrayal is total. Story 9. A Man with No Gear. A solo hiker on the Ridge Trail, late October. I met them at the ranger station. They had a thin jacket, but no pack, no food. They said they were just walking. I was alone on a morning stretch that had the world in frost. The trail seemed to hold its breath. About a mile in, I saw someone ahead, standing awkward on a log like they'd been there for hours. He had a jacket, but no day pack, no poles, nothing for a proper hike. He watched the trail patiently as if waiting for someone to pass. When I got closer, he smiled and asked, "You heading up?" I said yes and offered a greeting. People wander the trails all the time. I thought he might be off-grid, homeless, someone who knew the forest better than any map. Something about him felt off. The way his gaze lingered on my hips, on the angle of my shoulders, as if he catalogued travelers. I moved faster. Later, I rounded a bend and found my old water bottle neatly balanced on a rock ahead, like a marker. My stomach dropped. I picked it up and found a folded piece of paper inside. It wasn't my handwriting. It had directions. Turn left after rock, go slow, we like company. I reported it at the next ranger post. They logged it as an odd encounter. He had no ID, no standing. Some hikers had reported similar men, people who watched, who left notes, who never camped and never carried gear. Some of them had ended up being harmless, drifters who collected odd things. Some had not. The witness described fleeing the trail at the next junction and hitching back to the ranger station, shaken by the intimacy of the man's attention. They said later they could still feel him when they closed their eyes. People who live without gear can watch those who do. Story 10. The Campsite with the Photos. A weekend backpacking trip that turned into a search. Late summer, 2 friends and me, 3 tents in a clearing. I remember the taste of canned chili, the laughter making small islands in the dark. On the second night, one of my hiking partners woke to rustling outside his tent. He unzipped and saw prints circling the campsite, shallow and human. In the morning, we found a set of footprints that didn't match ours. There were extra boot marks, and then, near the fire pit, a sweater had been left, soaked in something dark. We didn't touch it at first. We were still tired and wanted to assume a tragic animal story. But when we packed to leave, we found a phone wedged beneath a rock. Inside the gallery were photos. Photos of our campsite, our cooking pot, a close-up of someone's fingers holding a locket. Some images were taken from angles that meant the shooter had been in the trees or inside a tent. The worst were captures of us sleeping. We took the device to the sheriff. The file dates matched the night before. The sheriff's office told us they had other reports in the county. Images of campers taken without consent, sometimes invasive, sometimes just evidence that someone had been watching. They ran the phone for prints and found none that matched any record. The sweater was tested and returned inconclusively. We left early and didn't camp for a long time after. One of my friends still has a bad reaction to the smell of campfire smoke. The witness said the photos made the invasion real in a way nothing else had. The camera doesn't lie, even when people do. The sheriff's report described the incident as invasive surveillance. The phone was never connected to an identity. The trail sometimes records what your memory can't, and those images can haunt you longer than the night air. At that point in the collection, patterns start to thicken. Watching, sometimes silent, sometimes with camera shutters, is a through line. People alone at water or in bed, footprints that end at the waterline, small scraps of proof that point to someone's deliberate interest. The survivors' reactions are telling. Insomnia, extra locks, a nervous habit of checking attics. The mountains themselves become a kind of witness, but they rarely offer more than a riddle. I want to slow here for a moment and return to why these stories matter. It's easy to treat them as entertainment, Strange noises and midnight footsteps make for a good thrill. But each of these accounts is someone describing a moment when their personal world warped into something unrecognizable. The practical aftermath, calls to the sheriff, doors changed, houses sold, is the easy part. The harder part is the way this changes how you move through ordinary rooms, how you measure the space between safety and exposure. This collection is a mix of deliberate human predators, people who choose to live in the margins and become invasive, and things that we've left ambiguous on purpose. People who live off-grid in hollows are not necessarily the same as those who watch through windows. Still, in these mountain corners, the threshold between a harmless drifter and a threatening stalker can be thinner than a single board on a porch. There's more coming. Trail encounters that get physical, roadside traps that aim to stop you, and a handful of stories that blur the line between folklore and witness testimony. For now, we'll pause and keep going deeper into the hollows, where the trees hold more secrets, and where some of the survivors found themselves running, hiding, and making impossible choices to stay alive. Story 11. The Man at the Gas Station. A late-night stop on Route 23, out past the old mill. I had a long drive back home and needed coffee and a stretch. It was almost midnight when I pulled in. The lights inside the station hummed like a small electric sun.
The clerk was nodding at a late-night radio show. As I filled my cup, a man walked out of the shadows with a grin too wide for the hour. He asked me where I was heading and then started telling me a story about the road, about someone who got stuck and needed a ride. My first instinct was pity. He had no shoes, and even in my dimmed headlight I could see how thin he was. When I declined and said I had to get home, he persisted. He stood by my car and leaned like we were old friends. I felt cornered. I could see my keys. I could see the door handle. When I tried to close the door, he put a hand on the frame and then moved, blocking me. I rolled the window up a little. He tapped on the glass, not hard, but that slow, insistent rhythm that makes you wish the person would stop. The clerk came out then, and the man backed away like a shadow that didn't want to be seen. I drove off shaking. Later that night, I checked gas station security footage because I couldn't shake the feeling of being singled out. The store owner obliged, and I watched the recording. The man had followed me from the pump, walked to the driver's door, and then lingered in the parking lot like a guardian angel turned predator. There were others in different towns who posted similar warnings on community boards. Photos of the same face circulated like a small alarm. Police were notified. The man was picked up 2 counties over for vagrancy, but what unnerved me was how easily someone could get between you and your car in a split second. The witness called it harassment, an attempted confrontation. It didn't turn violent, but the threat felt as real as a hand on the door handle. After that night, I never road tripped alone after dark. Story 12. Blocked on the Hollow Road. An older couple driving home through a back road, late winter, slush like wet ash on the shoulder. They wanted to avoid the busy highway and found themselves on a slim 2-lane that wound through hollows. Halfway home, a pickup truck appeared behind them, lights too bright. The truck stayed tail on and then edged forward to pass. The road was narrow. You couldn't pass oncoming without giving room. When the couple slowed for a blind curve, the truck swerved in front and stopped, blocking the way, engine idling like it had all the time in the world. A man came out of the truck with a scythe like a prop and walked to their window. He was shirtless, breath steaming, and he had 2 other men in the bed who watched the couple like they were sightless animals. The man at the window banged on the glass and said something about help needed. It was a lie, a setup. The wife pushed the horn and the sound cut the quiet like a flare. In the chaos, the husband shifted the car into reverse and back down the shoulder, skidding through mud. They got enough distance to floor it toward the next lighted town. They reported the incident. The truck's license plate matched nothing in the database. The sheriff said these block and hold tactics had been seen in a few counties.
trucks stopping traffic to force victims out of vehicles for robbery or worse. The couple described the fear as monstrous. They changed their routine and started taking the highway, even on calm nights. The witness survived through raw instinct and a noisy horn. They never took that hollow road again. Story 13. The Cabin with the Scythe. A friend of a friend rented a remote cabin for a hunting week. The owner warned about stray dogs and asked them not to park on the lower path. They didn't listen. On the second morning, while they're out checking traps, one man returns to find the cabin door propped open and footprints in the fresh mud. Inside, chairs were overturned like someone had practiced falling furniture. On the kitchen table, there was a scythe, planted with its blade in the floor as if marking territory. They ran next door to an elderly neighbor who said he'd seen men in hoodies coming through the property at weird hours. He told them to leave. They left. The sheriff's deputy who took their report was blunt. These are the people who think the mountains are theirs. The cabin had been violated. The tool left like a warning. The witnesses said they felt hunted rather than robbed. Some folks in the county suggested these were drifters or aggressive neighbors. Others whispered about off-grid groups who patrol territory. The immediate aftermath was a rapid departure. The emotional aftermath was a long reluctance to return to hunting. The men sold their gear a season later. For one of them, the scythe became a symbol of the line he had crossed without knowing it. I stop here with the trail and road stories because the next ones pick up the pace in a different way. Unexpected sightings on ridgelines, nighttime figures in the trees, photographs that turn up in odd places. The tone shifts toward encounters that are harder to explain. Are they human? Something else. The survivors often use the same words: not human, feral, unlike anyone I'd met, and then correct themselves to mean only that these people moved and watched as if town rules never applied. The mountain hollows make you small and readable. People with ill intent can take advantage of that. The next batch of stories will push that boundary further into the realm where survival hinges on a decision made in a single heartbeat, where a flashlight can be both shield and signal, and where the thin line between the known and the unknown blur under the canopy. Story 14. The Door That Wasn't Locked. A summer evening in a hollow known for its old stone fences and late lightning bugs. I was staying at my cousin's place for a week while they were out of town, the kind of favor you do for family. Feed the cat, water the potted herbs, keep an eye on the mail. The house smelled like lemon oil and the faint sweet of stray mothball. I left lights on as agreed and slept with the bedroom window cracked. On the second night, I woke to the sound of wind at the back door, the rattle you hear when a porch lantern blows. I thought it was thunder. I thought my phone had vibrated. When I went to check, the back door was ajar. It wasn't supposed to be. That door had a deadbolt. At first, I blamed the dog, a lazy old lab that liked to escape under the fence. The floor was cool under my feet. I pushed the door and it swung inward without resistance. The porch light blinked. On the kitchen table, someone had set a ceramic cup upside down and left a small coin on top. It was the kind of tiny, deliberate thing that feels like a signature rather than a mistake. I called my cousin and she rushed over, tearful and furious. She swore the house was secured and that she had changed the locks a month before. We called the sheriff. They logged it as a trespass. They dusted the back steps and found mud from a boot that didn't match the pattern of anyone in the household. The witness said this felt personal, not merely a fluke break-in. Someone knew the routines, the do-not-touch spots, the way the porch light was left to lull you to sleep. That night we slept in clothes and kept a heavy lamp on. The next morning there was a fresh scratch on the paint by the knob, like someone had tried to turn it quietly, and a small child's shoe print in the edge of the dirt by the stoop. The sheriff wrote it into the report as evidence of entry and recommended extra locks. They couldn't say who had been there. The witness quit leaving the house empty for long stretches ever since. The idea that a home might be entered and rearranged with an almost polite gesture lingered like a stain.
Story 15. The Neighbor Who Wasn't There. Late October, a duplex on a ridge where every house has a view and everyone still knows which mailbox belongs to who. I lived there for a year and every morning waved to the neighbor who mowed his lawn at dawn. One morning he didn't come out. A week later, while bringing in groceries, I noticed a light in his window at dusk. 10 minutes of light that burned on and then died. It wasn't like him to be away without telling anyone, so I walked over. The door had been propped, and inside things were dusted with the same lived-in disorder you'd expect. Newspapers, a coffee mug, a coat on a chair. On top of the refrigerator, however, were Polaroids of my own porch, taken from the angle of his kitchen window. One photo even showed the back of my head as I had once stood on my steps petting a cat. Police came and took a report. The witness explained that she had been photographed without consent and that the neighbor's keys were gone from his hook. The officer said people sometimes take keys when houses are empty to watch from a safer vantage. The house itself offered no answers. No one was found in the walls or behind the paneling.
Later, neighbors said they'd noticed a man in a hooded coat moving between properties at odd hours. He slipped away each time like smoke. I sold the duplex within months. The notion that someone could occupy the space between your life and your neighbor's, not technically trespassing, but still inside your periphery, made the whole street feel vulnerable. For the witness, the boundary between what belonged to her and what didn't had been quietly erased. Story 16. Content warning. The camera in the nursery. Content note: the next account involves voyeuristic intrusion related to a child's room. I'll keep the details restrained. It was a small farmhouse in April. New baby in the crib and new exhaustion in the parents' eyes. They moved back to the county to be near family. The house seemed to breathe with ordinary life. A kettle on, a dog that snored, a porch where the baby spent afternoons napping. One afternoon, while cleaning, the mother found a small black object tucked into the seam of the curtain rod above the crib. A tiny lens peeking out, no larger than a bead. She didn't want to assume anything, but it was the kind of thing you don't ignore. She took it to the sheriff. They treated it as evidence of illegal surveillance and took photographs before removing it. For the family, the discovery was devastating. The idea that someone had been watching the most private of moments left them shaken to the core. The sheriff suggested the device had been put by a person who wanted to observe without being seen, an allegation the family insisted on. The investigation was logged, with entries noting that similar microcameras had been discovered in other rentals and private houses across the county in recent months. Whether the same person was responsible remained unproven. The parents moved the baby to another room and eventually moved houses. The witness described months of checking the ceiling and the folds of curtains with a new surgical suspicion. There were no arrests connected to the find reported to the family. The case remained an allegation, an invasive possibility that changed how they thought about privacy forever. Story 17. Brake lights and a handprint. A rainy August night on Highway 19, the kind of rain that makes reflections trail like ships on a dark river. I was alone, headlights washing the lane, thinking only of home. Near a seldom-used turnoff, a truck pulled up behind me and stayed too close. I sped up and tried to find a safe place to pull over, but at the next dip, the truck came beside me and a gloved hand slammed on my passenger window. I flinched. The window stayed closed and the rain lashed like static. The truck's driver motioned for me to stop. Suddenly, a second vehicle blocked the road ahead, and the drivers stepped into the weather with flashlights and voices loud enough to be heard over the rain. I drove through a gap like a swimmer breaking waves, and I felt a slap as something hit the rear bumper. Nothing dramatic, but close enough to make the taillights strobe. Inside my car, a faint smear on the passenger window, dried mud in the shape of a hand, stuck on like the mark of a promise. At the next service station, I called the sheriff. They told me this had been reported in a string of recent incidents. Cars boxed in on narrow roads to force compliance, often petty theft,
sometimes intimidation for reasons no one could prove. I reported it and later found that the truck that boxed me in had been spotted by a highway camera passing the same curve at the same time in other nights. The license plate was partial in the footage and led nowhere. The witness went to therapy for months after, unable to get the image of the faces in the rain out of her head. The physical mark, a smudge of mud, became a small talisman of the night, proof that something had tried to touch her world and had almost reached inside. Transitioning out of the road and into the trees, the next stories sit in the place where people aren't merely threatened, they are followed, circled, and sometimes photographed in ways that suggest an intent beyond a simple threat. The survivors speak of a tension that deepens into obsession. Now we go back into the ridgelines, where silhouettes take shape and decisions are made on tiny instincts. Story 18, The Figure on the Ridge. Late twilight on a ridge known for clear sunsets. The witness had hiked up to watch the light change and settled on a rock to breathe in the view. There was a silhouette at the far edge, half in shadow, someone standing very still, hands tucked into sleeves, watching the valley. The person didn't move as the witness approached, didn't even look like they heard the footsteps. Up close, the face was obscured by a hat pulled low, and the features were weirdly smooth in the fading light, like an old photograph left too close to the sun. When the witness asked, "You okay up here?" the figure tilted its head and said nothing. Then it turned and walked in a way that the witness later described as off, not quite how people in town shifted their weight or crossed a trail. It moved with economy, choosing footfalls like a hunter. The witness hurried back down, checking over their shoulder until the final switchback. Later that week, a friend sent a picture taken from a different angle, a small figure on the ridge captured in a grainy handheld shot. The timestamp matched the evening the witness had been up there. The figure's posture in the photo suggested it had been waiting. People in town murmured about a friend who walked the ridges to feel alone and a stranger who liked to watch sunsets. The sheriff said they had no evidence of wrongdoing. The witness's reaction, however, was not about illegality so much as about being witnessed where they had thought themselves private.
Story 19, The Eyes That Reflected Back. A midsummer night at a campground that borders a thick stand of pines. I was on a long drive and pulled over to sleep in the back of my truck. It seemed safe enough. Campsites are full of other people, even if you can't see them in the dark. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of someone moving among the trees. I shone my flashlight and caught a pair of eyes reflecting back. Not the apple-green glow of a deer, but a set of small lights in a face-shaped outline. The witness described the eyes as too pale, like glass beads held in shadow. The figure didn't respond when spoken to. Instead, it took a step sideways, and the reflection of the beam returned, like a mirror holding your light and answering with silence. I stepped out of the truck, and the figure melted away into another patch of trees. In the morning, the witness found a trail of small footprints leading into the woods and ending at a flattened spot beneath a cedar, as if someone had settled there and waited. When they checked the photos from their phone, an exposure showed a blurred shape with antler-like protrusions. The witness insisted it had been a person. Others joked it was a child with reflective stickers. No one could agree. The emotional aftermath. The witness stopped sleeping in their truck and started choosing well-lit rest stops. They traded solitude for the petition of people. The eyes in the dark were one more thing that taught them how easily one can be observed without consent, and how the reflection of a flashlight can sometimes be the only answer you get. Story 20, The Deer Head That Stared Back. This one ends the collection not with an explanation, but with a question that stayed lodged in someone's throat. Late fall at a small lodge that draws hikers for its ridge views. The witness was a night manager, responsible for closing up and checking the grounds. On one closing, they went to check the cameras. This lodge kept old analog security at the parking ring. When they rewound the tape to the previous night's recording, there was a short clip, a figure moving through the trees with slow, deliberate steps, stopping at the edge of the lot to face the camera. The head is a deer skull, all antlers and hollow sockets. It tilts its head as if listening.
In the frame, you can feel the way the antlers cut the moonlight. The witness said they had seen costumes, and they knew taxidermy, but something about the movements didn't match a prank. The person, if a person it was, moved in a way that suggested they'd spent time being quiet in the woods. After the footage circulated on the lodge's private board, messages arrived. People who'd been in the county decades reported similar sightings over years, often described as a kid in a mask, or a hunter with an old skull fastened for laughs. Others suggested that the figure used the skull as a kind of armor, anonymity masquerading as myth.
The lodge owner took the footage to the sheriff, who classified it as suspicious activity. No one was arrested. The witness kept rewinding the clip until morning arrived like relief. They quit closing the lodge nights alone. The footage remained, a small mechanical proof that some presence had come to stand where property met the thick dark. There is a final kind of silence that settles over these accounts. It's not the hush of night. It's the quiet that follows when you realize you have to decide how to live in a world where the edges of ordinary places can be occupied by watchers, squatters, pranksters, or something that wears a shape like a skull. The survivors in these stories chose to leave cabins, to sell houses, to avoid trails, to change the rhythm of their days because their sense of safety had been breached. That decision, to alter the map of your life because the mountain has its own appetite, is a form of survival in itself. Reflections and the long tail. Across these 20 accounts, you can trace a small grammar of fear, the first small wrongness, the evidence found in the light of morning, the way authorities file a report and then return to other calls. You can trace the shifts inside people, beds slept in clothes, windows double-checked, new locks, a sense that some spaces are no longer yours to claim. Survival in these stories is not always a dramatic chase with a halting rescue. Often it's a quieter thing, waking up, noticing an imprint on a tent flap, deciding not to return to a lake, selling a house, leaving a marriage, giving up a job that requires late-night drives. These are witness accounts, not verdicts. Where people allege crimes, those claims are recorded here as reported. Where a camera caught an image, that image is a witness in its own right. Where a footprint ends at the waterline, the water keeps the rest of the answer. I have tried to keep the ambiguity intact. There is a fine line between calling something a person or a presence, and the truth often sits in the small details the survivors remembered. The cadence of a step, the choice of a camera angle, the way a mask tilted its head. A few practical notes that aren't instructions for wrongdoing but come from the aftermath of these accounts. Many survivors reported that they felt better when they talked about it, when they let someone know. Some found a neighbor who would check in nightly, or a friend who would ride with them to a car. Some called the sheriff and felt comforted by the simple act of filing a report. Some felt dismissed. The system around these places is imperfect, and the mountains themselves rarely offer easy answers. A closing story of sorts. After the footage with the deer skull circulated, an older woman who'd lived in that county for 50 years sent a message to the lodge owner. She wrote a paragraph about growing up listening to the woods, their peculiar ways of swallowing light, and about how, when she was small, people used to say the forest shows you back your face. Sometimes what you see is a person, she wrote. Sometimes it's what we make to keep ourselves from being lonely at night. She didn't excuse the invasions. She only put another way to look at them. The witness read the message and thought about the thinness between myth and method. Final thoughts and one last ask. These stories are assembled from people who remember small details because they had to. The folding of a jacket, the smell of diesel, the angle of a meal. They survived by paying attention, by choosing to move, by deciding to call a sheriff or a friend or a hotline. Survival is sometimes forgetting the exact face and remembering the rhythm of the run. Other times it is the opposite, keeping the face sharp in memory so you can warn someone else. If this collection left you uneasy, if you recognize one of these moments in your own life, you're not alone. If a memory from these accounts unsettles you, it might help to talk to someone you trust. There is no single solution. There is only the hard, steady business of taking care of yourself and one another. Before you go, one small request. If these true Appalachian accounts resonated with you, check the playlist of similar stories and subscribe. Our Halloween special this year will dig further into regional testimony and survivor accounts. Sharing these narratives helps spotlight patterns that matter, and sometimes it brings forward someone who knows something more. The mountains are beautiful, and they are dangerous. Sometimes they guard secrets that are small and human. Sometimes the answers are larger, older than us. Be careful where you leave your light, who you trust with your windows, and the roads you choose at night. The hollows keep their counsel, but people pass through them. Carry that caution kindly. You made it through 20 stories tonight. Be safe out there.